Well, hey there. I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Wednesday, March 2nd. And tonight we're talking about the escalating war in Ukraine. Russia appears to be more aggressive now in going after civilian targets.
We're looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine right now, including what's happening to civilians.
Today, Russian soldiers bombarded Ukraine's second largest city. They did not break through the front line of Ukrainian forces, though. We're live on the ground with the latest. Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson was making the rounds on Capitol Hill today. We'll lay out the timeline for the judge's confirmation hearings. Plus, last night was primary election night in Texas. That state has plenty of big races this year, including the governor's bid for a third term. And how much will the president's agenda keep Texan businesses booming? Small business owners from the Dallas area share their reactions to the State of the Union. No, it may not feel like it, but it has been 1 week since Russia invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainians are holding on, but the situation keeps getting worse. Russian troops have ramped up attacks on several key Ukrainian cities, including the capital, Kyiv. That raises concerns of attacks getting more aggressive, less precise, and deadlier to civilians. The resistance from Ukrainian troops has been strong enough to keep Russian troops stalled outside Kyiv's city center. They're also holding firm in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. That's despite a third day of heavy airstrikes. In southern Ukraine, it's a different story. Russia's defense ministry says it has taken control of the city of Kherson. That's northwest of Crimea, which Russia invaded in 2014. If true, Kherson would be the first major Ukrainian city captured in this invasion. Today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. is looking very closely at Russia's human rights abuses.
We've certainly seen in the past that one of Russia's methods of war is to be absolutely brutal in trying to cow the citizenry of a given country. And that includes, at the very least, indiscriminate targeting and potentially deliberate targeting as well.
Secretary Blinken also announced a new round of sanctions on Russia. Those include export controls on its ally, Belarus. And the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution condemning Russia's invasion. 5 nations voted against the resolution: Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Eritrea. 35 nations abstained, including China, India, and Iran. Let's begin live in Ukraine near the border with Poland, and that is where we find NBC's Cal Perry joining us from Lviv. Cal, what's the latest?
Joshua, we're talking about that heavy fighting in the eastern part of the country, and as you laid out, those southern towns, those are the ones that the Russians now seem to be taking control of, at least according to the mayors of a few of those towns. And when you look at it strategically, it makes sense. They're trying to create a land bridge from Crimea to those eastern provinces, those eastern part of the country. And this is where we thought the war would be fought if there was a war. Just in the east, it is, of course, much wider. In the last hour, we are hearing of massive explosions in the city center of Kyiv. It seems like the bombardment there is only getting worse tonight.
What's the latest you're hearing from people on the ground, including the Ukrainian government, about some of the new sanctions that have been announced?
Look, I think the Ukrainian government is absolutely supportive, and they have said they're supportive of all of these sanctions. I would clarify it, though, to say that these are people being bombed. These people are on the runs. You have 1 million folks have already left this country, according to the United Nations. So the government wants whatever it is going to take to stop the oncoming Russian troops, and that includes what we are now seeing, which is this sort of indiscriminate shelling of residential areas. So there is a need and a want, I think, on the Ukrainian government for, especially the American government, to go further. But of course, the American government is very interested in deconflicting between Russian soldiers and American soldiers. So I just think further military involvement is probably not likely. So they're going to have to sort of live with the sanctions they have now. But again, the need on the ground here, and when you talk to people, they say they want much more. They want a no-fly zone. They want this 40-mile column of Russian armor to be taken out. That's what people want. Certainly, at least for now, that's not what's going to happen.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about the global response in just a second, including those calls for a stronger military response. As you said, Western nations say that that is not in the cards. With regards to how people are doing where you are, I see that it's snowing behind you. How are folks holding up, especially with the weather, with the snow, and also just with the humanitarian crisis of people trying to push west into Poland?
Your point about the weather is an important one. You've got people now sleeping outside, folks who try to get to that border with Poland. It's about 50 miles from where I am, and last check, the cars were backed up about halfway here, more than 20 miles. Some people just leaving their cars, leaving the things in their cars, trying to walk to the border. Now, the Polish government has reduced the requirement for a visa. They're saying anybody can come for up to 3 months. They may extend that, but it doesn't change the humanitarian crisis on the ground here. Here in the city of Lviv, we're seeing a city that's starting to burst at the seams because people are getting stuck here. They can't get to Poland. They can't go back east, and folks are running out of places to stay. Add to that, you have the trauma now arriving in this city. It's like a delayed fuse. It took a couple of days, but we're seeing folks here just completely mentally exhausted and shattered and coming to this city with horror stories about traveling all the way from the east and then being on a train that got stuck inside Kyiv while this bombardment took place all around them. It is horrifying when you see the look, especially on children's faces who've never imagined that this could happen, suddenly being forced to flee their homes and to come to a strange place. It's shocking to see, and it just, it has to be absolutely horrifying to live. That's just what people here are dealing with, and it's happening in huge, huge numbers, Joshua.
And Cal, before I have to let you go, a few days ago, my family texted me this link asking, is this true? Is it true that they're turning around people of color at the border? And I was like, well, let me look into that. Sure enough, there's been some reporting, including from us, that there had been concerns from people of African descent who live in Ukraine or of different nationalities that say they had been mistreated at the border by people working border crossings and so on. And the government has said that it will do more to try to be more equitable. It's set up a hotline for people of African and Asian descent to call if they're having trouble. What is your sense, Cal, of how the government is adapting to this exodus of people from east to west? Are they kind of getting a handle on it, or is it really just quite chaotic wherever you look?
No, it's chaotic. They're reeling. They're trying to get the best handle on it that they can. Look, I've been interviewing people at the train station. Individually, they tell me they haven't seen this, but we know it's happening, and we partly know it because of these government statements. I'm going to just pull up one and read to our viewers. This is how we know it's happening from the Foreign Ministry. Quote, we've established this emergency hotline for African, Asian, and other students wishing to leave Ukraine. And then this comment as well from the government, quote, Africans seeking evacuation are our friends and need to have equal opportunities to return to their home countries safely. So the government is acknowledging that this is happening and that this is a problem. The videos circulating on social media are awful of folks getting pushed off trains. Some of that is chaos. Some of that is undoubtedly racism. It is happening in this war zone. And again, there's no question. I mean, look, the government, as of 8 days ago, was saying an invasion was unlikely, and then a week later, reeling from this refugee crisis. So it's certainly something that they need to sort out, and it's something they say that they are addressing.
Thank you, Cal. Please do stay safe. That's NBC's Cal Perry starting us off tonight from Lviv in western Ukraine. Now, last night, if you saw the State of the Union address here on NBC News Now, you heard President Biden take aim at some of Russia's most prominent businessmen, these oligarchs.
Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who built billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We're coming for your ill-begotten gains.
Forgive asking a dumb question, but what exactly is an oligarch? I mean, who are they? How did they get so rich and so powerful? And what do they have to do with you? NBC News Now anchor Hallie Jackson has the answers.
The modern Russian oligarch's story starts back in 1989.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The wall fell, and soon after, in 1991, so did the Soviet Union.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom.
After almost 70 years of Russian communism, where the state controlled everything, the Russian people saw huge political and economic change practically overnight. For most regular Russians, this seismic shift was chaotic. But for a select few businessmen known as oligarchs, they managed to rise to the top. The word itself is Greek, derived from oligarchy, and means rule of the few. An oligarch is one of those few. With the state no longer controlling major economic sectors, rich men who had been gaining wealth often in Russia's legitimate businesses and allegedly in the black market stood ready to take control if they had political connections. And many of them did. 1996, it looked as if the communists might return to power in the presidential election. Oligarchs stood together to help Boris Yeltsin's re-election. Infighting inside those elite circles helped bring on the Russian financial crisis of 1998, which in turn helped the rise of Vladimir Putin. At the time, the future president was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, reportedly gathering information on these oligarchs and the illegal ways they got rich. The oligarchs largely stood in line with Putin as he rose in the political ranks to prime minister, then president, and they've stayed in line, but that may be changing. Many of these so-called oligarchs have investments in the West, some calling for negotiations to start as soon as possible, others calling for an end to the war altogether.
That's Hallie Jackson reporting, and be sure to set your DVR for Hallie Jackson Now, weekdays at 5 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. GMT, here on NBC News Now. Ukraine's defenses are making a real dent in this invasion. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that nearly 500 of its soldiers were killed in Ukraine and more than 1,000 are injured. Now, that's a low estimate compared to what others have told us. Two Western officials claim the Russian casualties may be over 5,000. Meanwhile, Ukraine's government estimates that about 2,000 civilians have died. NBC News has not been able to independently verify these numbers. We probably won't be able to until the attacks have subsided, if ever. But let's put that last figure into some context. Roughly 2,000 Ukrainian civilians dead. From April of 2014 to last September, the UN says there were roughly 3,000 conflict-related civilian deaths in Ukraine. That's 3,000 in 7 years. Now, Ukraine is approaching that figure in 7 days. Let's continue now with NBC News national security and international affairs analyst Michael McFaul, who is also the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me back.
Let's pick up where Hallie's package left off with oligarchs. These sanctions on these uber-rich, somewhat questionable Russian billionaires and tycoons, what impact do you think that that will have compared to all of the other things that are being done to put pressure on Russia?
Well, I'm actually grateful you're doing a deep dive on oligarchs, because it's time, if we're going to be talking about them for days and weeks and months to come, to get a little more disaggregation. Not all oligarchs are alike. Many oligarchs, and let's just use that term because that's the one everybody uses, call them what you will, but a lot of them made their money in the 90s when Putin was not in power. They made their money through their connections to Yeltsin. And a lot of those people have international businesses. They're the ones with a lot of money abroad. They're the ones with the yachts. You just showed one of them, Mr. Deripaska. By the way, I used to work with all these people as part of my job as ambassador. When Putin came into power, he cracked down on some of the oligarchs. So this is something I think people need to understand. He said, either get loyal to me, or I'm going to take your assets, or I'm going to put you in jail. And the richest man in Russia at the time, in 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, he took his assets and he spent 10 years in jail. There's another group, call them oligarchs for shorthand, but they're people that are closer to Putin. They're people from the former KGB, where he used to work. And he appointed them to be, for instance, the head of Rosneft, the largest oil company, the head of Gazprom, the largest gas company. Those are the Putin loyalists. And here's the paradox, Joshua. The people that made their money in the 90s, they're the ones that are most affected by sanctions because they have money abroad, they have houses abroad, et cetera, yachts abroad. And they're the ones that the president is going after. Whereas the ones that are closest to him, they're the ones that are making money right now. There's been no sanctions on oil and gas. Let's just be honest about that. That money continues to pump in. And those people, including Putin, they don't care about those oligarchs living in London and their yachts. They actually don't like them at all. So we need to be very careful when we're throwing this term around, whether it's going to have the impact it will. We want it to have. And here's one reason why it'll take a long time. The ones that made their money in the 90s, they have no impact whatsoever. They're just trying to get their money out, get their families out right now. They have no way to leverage Putin, to influence Putin. The ones that are closest to him are the least independent from him. They are, Igor Sechin, a guy I met in 1991, the same day I met Vladimir Putin. He has been working for Putin his whole life. He's dependent on Putin for his wealth, not the other way around. So it's kind of hard to go and say, hey, boss, you got to stop doing these sanctions. It's hurting me, when Putin knows that he was the one that made Igor Sechin the rich oligarch that he is today.
That is clarifying, because I think it helps, Ambassador, to put some of these sanctions and these various measures in context with things like freezing assets or pulling Russia back from the SWIFT interbank messaging system. We just found out a few minutes ago that Japan has announced its support for the EU's efforts to ban more Russian banks from SWIFT. Japan has already frozen the assets of 3 banks. It says it's adding 4 more to that list, kind of reflecting the EU's announcement. Can I ask you also about something that the Defense Secretary said to NBC's Lester Holt in an exclusive interview today? Here is part of their conversation between Lester and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
I would just say that there's a lot of combat power that the Russians still have available to them. So they have a number of options going forward. One of those options, by the way, Lester, is that Putin can choose, is that he can choose to de-escalate, and he can choose to pursue a diplomatic solution, and we hope that he does that. But again, just based upon the combat power that we see that he has left, he can still do a number of things.
Ambassador, with regard to what the Defense Secretary said, that Putin can choose to de-escalate and he can choose to pursue a diplomatic solution, the more I think about it and the more I kind of learn about the history of all this, I think if Putin is so loyal to the idea of the Soviet Union as it was, kind of in its greatness as he viewed it, and if he knows the history of this country includes allowing millions of Ukrainians to die because grain was centralized by Stalin, I'm just not sure how someone with that sense of history suddenly feels like he needs to slam the brakes on a war and choose diplomacy when the idea of sacrificing your own people is in this country's history from his predecessors. I may be viewing this too bluntly, but how do you see it in terms of the potential for Vladimir Putin to stop this invasion and choose diplomacy?
Well, tragically, he's had a high tolerance for using violence against civilians. The war in Chechnya in 1999, the bombing of Syria after 2015, particularly in Aleppo, shows that he's willing to use military force to kill civilians. And that's very sobering what the Secretary of Defense just said. He has a lot of military capacity still left. We're only, several days into this conflict. And you're right. We all want him to take that off-road. And I think, lift sanctions in return for leaving. We should always remember that the goal, at least the way I understand President Biden's goal here, is to end the war. And so we should do whatever we can to end the war, including lifting sanctions if he leaves. There's just little evidence so far that that is an avenue that he wants to go down. I hope the other part, though, about that history, you mentioned one history. I want to add some other history, though, from the Soviet history. Yeah. When they invaded Afghanistan, because this reminds me of Brezhnev's invasion of Afghanistan. He thought it was going to be a cakewalk. They're going to build Marxism-Leninist regime there, just like they'd done other places. And we know how that ended tragically for the Soviet army there. I hope Mr. Putin's learning that lesson of Soviet history as well.
Wouldn't that be interesting if this went the way of Afghanistan? Since you mentioned military options, in the last few seconds we have left, I want to get to a quick viewer question that reflects something that I think a lot of people have been saying, including some of the folks I just met in Dallas in the last few days. Lana asked, we wouldn't stand by and watch a teenager beat up a preschooler on the playground. Why is the world sitting back and watching Putin kill innocents and bomb neighborhoods? In my opinion, this goes beyond rules of war. This is a humanitarian crisis. Ukraine did nothing to provoke but exist. Ambassador, what would you say to Lana before we go?
Lana, that's a great question. That is a very powerful question. And for me personally, it reminds me of a note I got from one of my Ukrainian friends the night this war started, when she said to me, yeah, thanks for all your solidarity. Thanks for your weapons. But I can't believe we have to fight him alone. That is Vladimir Putin. And the answer to Lana is we do not want to risk. President Biden has made the decision that he does not want to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. And that's a decision he's made. No boots on the ground, no fly zone, because we don't want to risk going to war with a nuclear power Russia. That's the explanation. But you can tell by the way I'm answering it, it doesn't feel good. And I think if we see more and more civilians die, I think there should be more pressure for the West to do more to try to end this war.
On another night, I want to pick up with this phrase, World War III, that people keep throwing around in terms of what the implications of actually doing what Lana suggested might be. But unfortunately, I think we'll have a lot more opportunities to discuss that. Ambassador Michael McFaul, always good to speak to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Still to come, more on the human toll of the war in Ukraine, from the people fleeing the attacks to their loved ones here in America praying for their safety. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is growing fast. The United Nations says nearly 900,000 people have fled, at least so far, but the UN estimates that up to 5 million people might end up leaving Ukraine. We just heard from NBC's Cal Perry. He also met a woman from Kharkiv who's part of this exodus. She says her home burned in the fighting and her loved ones died.
It was like pretty much giving your soul to God every second, because our train stopped in the middle of Kyiv, and they were shooting, and we heard bombs flying all over and planes, and I thought, this particular moment I can die.
Mentally, how did you survive?
I don't think I did. We all are just super, mentally we are broken, and to be honest, I do have PTSD. I do. Very bad, kind of. Every time I hear sound or anything, I start shaking.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Please do cherish a clear sky. Every time you see sky, cherish every moment of your life.
Joining us now is Ali Markovich. She's a journalist at Berkeley Side, an independent nonprofit news site in Berkeley, California. Ms. Markovich, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
First of all, let me just ask about you and your family back in Ukraine. Have you heard from them? How are they holding up?
So I was born in Ukraine in a town called Odessa. I don't have any family there now. I have my parents, friends, and their extended network. But on my dad's side, all of us left and moved to Cleveland, to the United States, in the 90s. So I don't have immediate family there. My parents are hearing from their friends every day. And just a few hours ago, actually, my mom heard from one of her childhood friends who was saying that the fighting is getting closer and closer to Odessa. So I think there's a heightened sense of fear for my parents and for me right now.
My Ukrainian geography is rusty, but tell me a little bit about Odessa. I believe that's in the southern part of Ukraine. It's a port city, right?
Right. It's on the Black Sea, and so far it's managed to avoid the kind of destruction that we've seen across other cities in the country. And I've been crossing my fingers that we wouldn't see that in Odessa. But as it happens, I think that the city is becoming an increasingly crucial strategic point, and the Russian army is, I believe, approaching from the east, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, I would imagine that it is, considering that, Odessa kind of sits along, I believe it's the Black Sea, and it kind of leads to the Dnieper River, which goes up through Ukraine, kind of runs alongside Kyiv. So that would be strategically important if they were able to kind of get control of that waterway. What is your reaction to some of the solidarity that's been shown here in the United States? I've heard from Ukrainians and Ukrainian Americans that they appreciate it. It's not enough to make the conflict stop, but it's welcomed. How do you see it?
Of course. I mean, let me tell you about my experience being Ukrainian growing up. when I was a little kid, I would just tell my friends that I was Russian because I assumed that they wouldn't know what Ukraine was. Now, my mom recently was telling me, she had a kind of similar experience. My family speaks Russian, and that was an easy solution to people's ignorance, honestly. And my mom was telling me that recently she was on a trip, and when she said, I'm from Ukraine, there was immediate recognition and sympathy from the stranger that she was talking to. So I wish that that wasn't the reason that the world had drawn their attention to the country that I was born in. But I am really glad that people are learning about Ukrainian culture and history, myself included. I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and throughout my upbringing, certainly learned about Ukraine. But like many others, I'm inspired to learn increasingly more about beautiful traditions and literature and music of this country.
I'm really sorry that was your experience growing up. That's really lame, that it was easier for you to just say that you were Russian than actually saying that you were what you are. I'm sorry that you had to deal with that. I'm glad more of us are learning now. But now it feels like we also have to figure out, as Americans who are learning about Ukraine, how to best interface and get involved in this conflict. I got to let you go in a second, but could I just get your reaction to something that the president said last night in the State of the Union address? Obviously, he began by talking about the war in Ukraine. Here's part of what the president said. Watch.
Together with our allies, we're providing support to the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom. Military assistance, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance. But let me be clear, our forces are not engaged and will not engage in the conflict with Russian forces in Ukraine.
Ms. Markovich, before I have to let you go, what did you make of the president's remarks last night about Ukraine?
Like many other people who are watching this, I think that I feel simultaneously so glad for the support and solidarity, and also terrified that despite that, this war is continuing and that so much destruction is happening to people and into an entire country. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Ali Markovich, I appreciate you making time. I appreciate you talking about your heritage and your identity and being able to own that you are Ukrainian American and not some other thing that's not Ukrainian American. I'm glad that we have your perspective on this, and I thank you for making time for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
The exodus in Ukraine includes trains and buses that are packed with refugees. They've abandoned their belongings, their loved ones, their homes to survive this war. From our partners at Sky News, John Sparks has this exclusive report.
No one knows if or when the train will come, but in the city of Dnipro, there are thousands of people keeping watch. Their past and their present has been packed into bags, while their future lies on platform 1. The trains head west to the city of Lviv, which stands as some sort of beacon, but nobody wants to leave their home. How do you feel?
Very bad, very, very bad.
Why?
I'm very angry.
Why?
Because Putin.
Weighty decisions are made in a moment by those who have no time to think. How do you feel in your heart?
So bad. Люди должны бросать свои дома и все, что у них есть, и я не знаю, но это на самом-то деле ужасно, потому что, я хотела жить в мире, и я думала, что у нас все хорошо, а одним днем получается все.
It's beginning to slow down now, and there is going to be one almighty crush as people try to get on. This map's not in a good way, but they're going to get him on. Propelled by fear, they battle to board as the train attendants beg them to step back. Bags are hoisted from passenger to passenger, and within a few minutes, The train is full. Careful, don't fall, don't come in, he begs. The majority on this train are women and children. Men between 18 and 60 are expected to stay and fight. So those on board made their solitary farewells. Natalia Nekrasa is taking her son to safety. Her husband will stay behind in Dnipro.
Потому что я разрываюсь, я должна увезти ребенка в безопасное место, и в то же время половина души остается с теми, кто остался в Днепропетровске.
I asked her where she was planning to go.
Во Львове у нас некуда ехать, у нас там никого нет, не знаю.
Some feel shame for leaving their loved ones. Others struggle to make sense of it as the train speeds them away from the front lines. Oleg is from the city of Volnovakha. And his daughter Sonia is terribly confused. She wonders what has happened to her school friends. The train stops in towns and villages as we travel through the middle of the night. And on every platform there are people with suitcases trying to get in. Where are they going? We won't let them board, says one. The train conductor refuses to open the doors. As we approach our final destination, passengers like Irina, who has been traveling for days, contemplate the nature of their escape.
How are you doing?
Страх и ненависть, и какое-то опустошение внутри. Вообще все переменилось внутри.
They arrived in Lviv to the sound of air raid sirens, a reminder of everything they left behind. So the majority will continue this journey, moving west into the arms of the European Union, a great exodus of reluctant travelers wondering if they'll ever go home. John Sparks, Sky News in Western Ukraine.
Coming up, we will have more on the testimony today about the death of Breonna Taylor. A former officer from that raid took the stand today, but not really about Ms. Taylor's death. Plus, baseball fans will have to wait even longer for the season to start. An update on the Major League lockout is just ahead. Stay close. Let us get into your headlines with an update on the raid that killed Breonna Taylor. Today, former Louisville police detective Brett Hankison testified in his own defense. He explained his decision to open fire in Ms. Taylor's apartment. The charges he faces are not for her death, but for endangering a family next door. Mr. Hankison faces 3 counts of wanton endangerment. He's pleading not guilty. He was part of the police raid back in March of 2020 that ended with Breonna Taylor's death. Now, when the police entered her apartment, her boyfriend shot at the officers. He hit one of them in the leg. He had his gun legally and apparently thought they were intruders. Brett Hankison says he fired in the direction of a muzzle flash. None of his bullets hit anyone, but a child was in the apartment. Again, this is the apartment next door. Mr. Hankison testified that he felt horrible when he learned about that. Those next door neighbors are a couple whose son was 5 at the time. They said the raid was as if somebody set off a bomb. Mr. Hankison testified that he absolutely did not do anything wrong in the raid, and his attorneys argue that he was defending his fellow officers. Brett Hankison is so far the only officer in the raid to be indicted. Closing arguments and jury deliberations are set to begin tomorrow. The formal courtship is underway between President Biden's Supreme Court nominee and Congress. Today, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson met with key senators ahead of her confirmation hearings. Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin announced that the hearings will run from March 21st to the 24th. She will testify on the 22nd and 23rd. And today, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for his colleagues to move this process along.
Once the Judiciary Committee completes its consideration of Judge Jackson, I will move to have her nomination come immediately to the floor of the Senate. We are going to have a fair but expeditious process, where members from both sides will get to ask their questions and explore the judge's record.
The president nominated Judge Jackson last week. If confirmed, she will succeed Justice Stephen Breyer, who is retiring. Last year, Jackson became a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. She would become the first black woman on the Supreme Court if she is confirmed. Spring training camps for Major League Baseball are quiet tonight, with neither side ready to play ball on a labor deal. Last night, the league and the players' union failed to resolve a collective bargaining agreement. Doing so would have ended a lockout that was started by team owners. That means opening day will not happen this month. 91 regular season games are now off the schedule. MLB's Commissioner Rob Manfred says the talks could start up again tomorrow.
Not going to be able to play the first two series of the regular season, and those games are officially canceled. We're prepared to continue negotiations. We've been informed that the MLBPA is headed back to New York, meaning that no agreement is possible until at least Thursday.
Now, the MLBPA is the players' union, and it said that the situation is a, quote, culmination of a decades-long attempt by owners to break our player fraternity. They added, quote, as in the past, this effort will fail, unquote. Now, the last time that Major League games were delayed or canceled for a work stoppage was 1994. That's when the players went on strike. That walkout led to more than 900 games being canceled. We'd love to hear from you on this lockout. Maybe you're a diehard baseball fan. Perhaps your business depends on traffic from baseball fans. How is this affecting you? And how should they resolve this? Share your thoughts with us. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Where else could be better to watch the State of the Union address than in Washington? In Dallas, with a group of small business owners focused more on what the president will do than on what he said. Their thoughts on what the Biden agenda means for them when we come back. President Biden's agenda has a lot to do with getting people working at good-paying jobs that are hard to export overseas. So who better to watch his State of the Union address with than people who can create these kinds of jobs? That's what we did last night with small business owners from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we had so much fun. They ranged from brokers to bakers to barbecue makers from many walks of life, including Ukrainian. Here are some of their reactions to the State of the Union. So we wanted to talk to a mix of people with a different lens. That's why we aimed for business owners, because we wanted to talk to doers. Anything from the speech, Rodney, that resonated with you?
Well, I think the president said, approve my Federal Reserve nominees. And I think everybody's concerned, whether it's small business, big business, an individual business, what is the Federal Reserve going to do over the next 12 to 24 months? And how is it going to impact someone's pocketbook?
Dwight, anything that resonated with you, sir?
But one of the bigger things I saw, or I really felt, he was trying to bring us together. And he seemed to accomplish some of that just from watching both sides. They were not sitting on their hands. They got up.
Constance, what resonated for you?
As a small business owner, I applied for some of these grants and loans that he brought up. There was so much red tape around it that it was almost impossible to actually get to the nitty and the gritty. As she said just now, that resonated with me is that the shipping cost, even if it's not foreign, for me as a caterer, and I'm sure you see this too in your market as a barbecue master, meat that is here and now, it's still too expensive.
Natalia, what resonated for you?
What resonated for me the most was the response to the war in Ukraine. So we heard President Biden speak about
what do the people of Ukraine feel? And I'm 56 years of age. They've said if you're under the age of 60 that you are being a man there, that you're having to stay, you're having to go fight now. What would that be like to tell my wife goodbye, to tell my children goodbye?
Kyla, could I start with you in terms of what you heard from the speech tonight? that you felt was very directly relevant to your business. You mentioned manufacturing in the U.S. That was one thing. Was there anything else, or is that kind of the top of the list for you?
That's going to be the top of the list, our inflation and the prices, because it affects my rent increases. It affects my revenue. It affects my products, the prices rising, and just my freedom of time, because I'll be spending more of my free time working.
Dwight, what about you? What was top of mind for you?
Lower costs, lowering your costs. Plus, as she mentioned, the proteins that are sky high now, and you can't keep putting that on the consumer. I mean, you can't keep jacking your prices up to try to compensate for that.
What did you think of what the president said about immigration?
I thought some people should have sat down, but in the room. But I did like that he touched on the topic, because as being a Mexican American here, I do have a lot of family and friends that are still undocumented, and they weren't brought here with they weren't brought here against their will, but they were brought here young, right? And they're in this position where they don't see, the light of day, like it doesn't come to an end, where they can't apply for, it's harder for them to apply for schooling, for them to get loans, for them to just move forward in life like we normally would, or we don't take like the things that we do day to day for granted. They can't do as easily. So I really wish that he would do something quite, rapidly for them, because it's a really sad position to see all these bright, young, youthful people really waiting to give to the world, and they don't have any hope.
Dr. McEllier, go ahead.
So I do a lot of immigration physicals, and a few years ago I would do 300-400 physicals a month, mostly from Hispanics. Now I do about 20 per month. And I think that's a reflection of what's happened to the legal immigration system. I think it was dismantled by the previous administration. And now we're in a situation where I can't keep employees. I am starving for employees in my place of business. The price has gone up. It is an incredible market, because I just can't find people.
I'm with Natalia. I want actionable steps, shorter term, because I saw a lot of lofty goals that are quite a few years out. So I'd like to see us address the country right now.
Big thanks to everybody who joined us. Thanks to KXAS TV in Dallas for helping us get the word out. And thanks to our crew on the ground in Dallas, especially producer Kayla McCormick. Kayla, you really cast this well. Thank you so very much. Now, Texas was a political split screen last night. You had the State of the Union address, but also a heated primary election. We'll sum up the results, including a scandal that upended one congressional race. Before we go, the State of the Union address played very differently in Texas, because it shared the spotlight with that state's primary election, the first primary of the year. In the race for governor, two big names won handily: the incumbent, Republican Greg Abbott, and Democratic challenger Beto O'Rourke. Governor Abbott is running for his third term. Mr. O'Rourke is vying to flip the Texas governorship blue for the first time since 1994. In general, it was a good night for incumbent candidates, with one notable exception: the state's Republican Attorney General, Ken Paxton. He got the most votes, but he failed to get an outright majority, and in Texas, that triggers a runoff. Mr. Paxton will challenge Texas Land Commissioner George P. Bush. He runs the state agency that oversees public lands. He is the nephew of former President George W. Bush and the grandson of President George H.W. Bush. Among the higher-profile races for Congress, incumbent Henry Cuellar will go to a runoff against human rights attorney Jessica Cisneros. His district runs from San Antonio south to the Mexican border. Ms. Cisneros got a number of endorsements, including from Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, the latest results show that she came within 2 percentage points of Congressman Cuellar. Let's get some more context on these races with Patrick Svitak. He's the primary political correspondent for the Texas Tribune. Mr. Svitak, welcome.
Good evening.
Any top-line findings, any headlines from the Texas primary in terms of what the results tell us so far about the Texas electorate?
Well, as you pointed out, it was generally a good night for incumbents, especially on the Republican side. The big outlier, though, is the Attorney General Ken Paxton, who has some unique vulnerabilities given his legal problems, which include securities fraud charges dating back to 2015, a more recent FBI investigation over claims that he abused his office to help a wealthy donor. So that race and that incumbent are kind of a unique outlier in this case. If you look at some of the races in Texas that national progressive groups and their allies were targeting, it was a bit of a mixed bag. In the 35th congressional district, Greg Casar, the former Austin City Council member, was able to win outright in his primary pretty convincingly, and I'd say that was probably the biggest progressive win of the night. But as you pointed out, that race between Henry Cuellar and Jessica Cisneros is headed to an overtime round, and Cuellar is the one who came out narrowly on top. Obviously not enough to win outright. And so that, I think, is kind of a mixed result for progressives. There was another congressional race in Dallas that they were hoping to win outright. Their candidate there, State Representative Jasmine Crockett, came in just below 50%, and she's now heading to a runoff. And so a little bit of a mixed bag, I think, for some of the national progressive groups.
Yeah, Jasmine Crockett was running in that race to replace or to succeed Eddie Bernice Johnson in the Dallas area, who's one of the longest-serving members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the first nurse to be elected to Congress, a race that was really very closely watched, and she endorsed Jasmine Crockett, and that's going to a runoff as well. What about voting? There was a lot of concern among voting rights advocates before the election about some of the changes in Texas law. Your colleague Alexa Uro covered some of those concerns and said that a number of ballots from Texans remain in peril because they didn't quite comply with the change in ID requirements for voting by mail. How's that look today?
Yeah, some of this is really concerning, and it's obviously a function of this being the first major election happening under the new Texas voting law. Texas already had some of the strictest voting laws in the country before this new law was passed. And as Alexa pointed out in her story, one of the most concerning things are some of the county-level rejection rates that we were seeing for mail-in ballots. This law created stricter ID requirements to be able to vote by mail. And so you had folks encountering these requirements for the first time, sending in their applications or sending their ballots and having them rejected. And so you saw in some of these counties, I think Alexa pointed out, rejection rates ranging from 8% to 30%, which I think in the 2018 midterms in Texas statewide, the rejection rate was like 2%. And so you saw some alarmingly high rejection rates as voters are confronting these new requirements and trying to figure out how to abide by them.
This race with Congressman Van Taylor, his race for re-election in the Dallas area, that got real salacious real quickly today. What happened there? That seemed to kind of come out of nowhere.
It did a little bit. So this was already kind of one of our closely watched Republican congressional primaries because he was facing a group of challengers who were basically saying he wasn't, loyal enough to former President Donald Trump because he voted for a proposed bipartisan commission to investigate January 6th. This was the commission, I should say, that never actually became law. It's not the committee that is doing work now, but he still took a lot of heat in his party for that. And so it was already a hot race because of all the criticism he was getting for that. But then on the day before the primary, Breitbart put out a story, featuring allegations of infidelity. And he didn't respond to it at the time, didn't respond to it on election day. But today he came out and told his supporters that, he didn't confirm necessarily all the details, but he came out and said that, yes, I had an affair and, it's one of the biggest mistakes of my life. And he announced that he would not seek re-election any further. And so he is basically, he's out of his race now. He's going to take his name off the ballot. And the runner-up that he was going to go to a primary runoff with, a guy named Keith Self, the former Collin County judge, is now effectively the Republican nominee for that seat. And because it's drawn to favor Republicans, he's likely to win in November and be the next congressman.
Briefly, before I have to let you go, the White House put out a statement tonight about what it described as Texas's attacks on transgender youth. The Department of Health and Human Services is putting the state on notice that some of these policies might put children's lives at risk. I was looking at the political ads in Texas while I was in Dallas, all the social issues. I mean, I haven't seen the word woke that much since the last time I cut on BET. It seemed like every social issue in the world was like the reason for some of the races in Texas. How much is the general going to come down to social issues versus everyday policy issues? Briefly, before we go.
Yeah, I think you're going to see Republicans steer away from some of those social issues as they get into the general. I think Governor Greg Abbott in his race, as he faces a serious challenge from Beto O'Rourke, is going to speak more about the strength of the Texas economy coming out of COVID, other kind of less controversial ways in which Texas leads the nation versus some of these social issues that have captured national interest recently.
Patrick Svitek of the Texas Tribune, I appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
And hey, thank you for making time for us. Remember to send us your stories about the Major League Baseball lockout. How will a pause on America's pastime affect you? We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Thanks to those of you who have already started sending us voicemails. We're going to work our way through those now that we're done for the night. But until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Keep the comments coming, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.